Good morning and welcome to our Essential Skills series, kindly sponsored and powered by Flowgas. So this is session 11 on communication and remote presentation skills, Present to Connect, and it's going to be presented by Maureen McCowan. So Maureen, I'm very much looking forward to your session this morning. So over to you. Thanks, Maureen.
Thanks, Alva, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Just to get started, have a think for a moment, because if I said to you that you were going to be asked to deliver a presentation to clients next Monday, how would you start your preparation? What's the first thing that you would do? And if you're like many of the clients that come to me, your answer is that you'd open up the laptop, that you'd pull out a new PowerPoint and that you'd start putting all of the content into it. Now, if you Google the phrase death by PowerPoint, you'll be bombarded with memes and with blog posts and even a TED talk telling you what not to do so that you're not going to bore your audience to death. And believe me, I checked this out yesterday when I was preparing for this. So we see poor presentations all the time. Even though we know what we should be doing, we still see bad examples all of the time. And I want you to have a think about that as well, because I'll be asking you to maybe put some examples into the chat later on as to what you have seen people do wrong or what annoys you most when you're watching people delivering their presentations. Now, it is challenging enough to sit through a poor presentation in person, but when we are in a remote situation and you're logging in from home or a remote environment, that makes it even harder. So when you think about it, honestly, how many times have you had someone delivering their presentation on your laptop and you're working away in the background doing something else? Now flip that around and you're the presenter. Your challenge is to keep people listening and engaged in your presentation when you're delivering it. You need to keep the audience attention. Now, Alva had mentioned there about the one-day workshop in September, and that's going to be focusing on communication and remote presentation skills. Today, we're taking a look at presenting to connect. How do you connect with that audience, whoever they are, when you're delivering your presentation? And we're particularly focusing on the idea of the slides, the presentation PowerPoint, if PowerPoint is the format that you're using. So first of all, just to introduce myself, my name is Maureen McCowan. I live here in Naas in Ireland with my husband, who is an automation engineer, and our youngest son, who is a graduate structural engineer. So I'm feeling right at home here today working with Engineers Ireland. My own background is secondary teaching, high school teaching. I was teaching languages, Irish and French. And when I set up my business, I changed from teaching teenage boys up to 18 years of age, teaching teenage boys how to communicate in Irish and French, to working with professionals and teams, helping them to communicate and to present clearly and with confidence. And believe me, this role is an awful lot less hassle than what I had all of what I was doing with teaching and correcting copies and no homework and so on. Nobody has ever come to no homework since I've set up business. So today's presentation, I've called it a pinch of PowerPoint, and I've chosen that name of it particularly because if you think about when you're cooking a meal and you're adding your seasoning, you've got a pinch, a smidgen of this, a pinch of that. It's a small amount. The meal is the main event. And that's similarly when you are delivering a presentation, the content, what you're saying and how you're saying it, that's the main event. Your PowerPoint is there to enhance it, to enhance the content. And today we're going to be taking a look at how exactly you're going to be able to do that. So if we take a look here at the work that we're going to be going through today for the next hour or so, you have three sections, because when I am working with clients preparing presentations, 3 is our magic number. We remember things when they're in a pattern, and 3 makes a pattern. So I'm focusing today on 3 elements when it comes to your PowerPoint presentation. First of all, why should we use slides at all? Secondly, we're taking a look at the what not to do side of things, and then looking at some best practice tips as we're going along as well. So there will be time for questions and answers at the end. If you want to put any questions, you've got the questions and answer box at the bottom of your screen there that you can use, or you can put them into chat, and Ailbhe's going to be keeping an eye on those as they are coming in, and we'll deal with those at the end. And also, Ailbhe, just tip you off there, if any examples of poor presentations come in, if you can call those out to me, it's great, because I won't be keeping an eye on the chat myself as I'm going through this. So let's have a look and see, well, why do we use slides in the first place? Because when I start working with clients, the first thing that I will say is, for this particular presentation, are slides needed? Because they're not always needed. If it is a non-technical presentation, if it is an introductory type of thing, then you might be able to create a much better rapport with the client by leaving the slides out. If you take a look in the situation when I move out of slides, I should have immediately got your attention. It looks different because I have stopped sharing my slides. So you're starting by thinking, well, are they needed at all? And what reason might we need for using them? And one of the reasons that we would use is because of people having different types of learning styles. Some of us are visual, some of us are auditory, and some of us are kinesthetic. So when I'm delivering my presentation, for those who are auditory, they're going to be catching most of the information that they need from what they hear, whereas the visual person is going to be learning it more from what they see. So the slides are complementing, back to what I was talking about there, for that, you know, the salt or pepper that you're adding into your meal, the herbs and the spices, that piece that you're adding in. You're complementing your content by having the visuals there. So that's first of all. Secondly, it can be for highlighting what the key points are of the presentation that you're talking about. So you want to make people aware of particular aspects that are important. So you're putting those key points into the slides so that they're going to be remembered. And again, if people have the slides as the notes afterwards that are sent on afterwards, a quick reminder to them as to what was discussed. And then the third point is to help people better understand and better remember what it is that you're after delivering in your slides. So that's back to the, do I need slides at all? Your question is, how is this slide going to help the audience better remember or better understand the points that I've made? And if you think that, if you have that as your check all of the time for yourself, does this slide help or not? If not, then maybe it isn't needed. The first is the crutch. The person who is using their slides as their notes, and everything is written down, every little bit of detail, to the extent that sometimes if the person just put up the slide and said nothing, you would have all that you needed there on the slide in front of you. Now think back to that point, that analogy that I made at the beginning about the meal. You know, your slides are there to enhance the meal. The content is what's important, but you are the presenter. You are the person who is delivering that content. And if I had everything written out on slides and just put them up there, and my role is to read the slides, well, that doesn't make any sense. It's not showing what I can do as a presenter. So first bad habit, using crutch. The second bad habit is that dumping ground, where all of the information that you've done, so you've put a huge amount of work into this, you've got all of this research done, and you want people to know that you have all of this work done. So you decide to just lob it all into the slides and include it all. And it's as a dumping ground, and it's overwhelming for people who are watching it. A couple of examples that I have here. One was for a client that I was working with recently who was had to deliver a presentation between 5 and 7 minutes long as part of an interview that he had for a third level organization. And he came to me and he had his slides done and there was overwhelm in them. And he said, but I know all of this content. I want them to know that I know it. And I said, well, if you pull out the content and you're able to speak around the topic, then you're showing that you know your stuff, because you're not reading it from a slide. It's something that the audience has to listen to learn. They have to listen to what you're saying to find out what the content is. So pulling it back can actually help to show your expertise in your field that bit more, because you're talking around the topic and you're showing what you know. It also frees you up because it means that you have your reminder. I have the 2 images there. They're my reminder of what I'm going to talk about, but I haven't got it scripted. It's not, this is exactly what I'm going to say, and I have to remember all of the points that are there because they're on the slide. So it gives you that freedom and that flexibility to talk around things. Secondly, another client that I was working with said, well, I'm going to be explaining this topic, but I'm putting extra information up on the slide for people to read while I'm talking. Now, it does not matter what you have on the slide, whether it's text or whether it's an image. If there's something visual there, that's where people's attention is focused. And when they're focusing on reading new information, they're not going to be listening to you, because as much as we like to think we can multitask, we can't. And our attention is going to be drawn towards the slide. So only include the information that is relevant on the slide. It's not that dumping ground for you for everything that you want to include in your presentation. Share your expertise through the way in which you're talking and that you're explaining it. And then the third is with regard to graphs and the use of graphs and the amount of information that's there. And particularly, these are random ones that I just pulled on for demonstration purposes. But if you take a look, think of presentations that you've seen like this, where there have been, the different types of graphs that are there. And as I'm talking to you now, chances are you're trying to see what's the connection between those 3. Are they 3 random ones? What's the writing? The writing is really small. I can't read it. And you're not listening to what the presentation is. So pull it back. Less is more when it comes to PowerPoint, really making sure that everything that's there is relevant. And you're not using it as a way of showing off all the research you've done. Let your speaking do that. The way that you explain it, do that. And think in advance as to how you are going to best explain the topic that you're dealing with. And we're going to move on from there into best practice situations. Curious, Elva, any bad examples come up from people?
Yes. So quite a few. So thanks for sharing, everybody. So we had some in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
So from Eamon, using 40 slides for a 30-minute presentation window. And from John Byrne, lack of details on slides is also an issue, particularly if a trainee wants to review the content months later. Very high-level slides don't help if the presenter is not there to explain. Mm-hmm. So I guess that's the other extreme of not having enough detail.
Yeah.
And then some questions that came in on the Q&A. So too much text that the presenter reads verbatim. So you talked about that, Maureen, and text that is inconsistent with what is being said.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, thanks for all of that. Just with regard to the too little text, if it is a case that you want to, that you need information, extra information being sent out for people to review, that it's like a review document, consider having 2 sets of slides. So the slide that you use to present, which is the pared back version, and then you can include more information on what's being sent out, so that if somebody doesn't attend the training, for example, or isn't at the meeting, that they have the information that they need, but that you're not putting all of that up. You're showing your expertise when you're delivering the presentation, so that you've the pared back version on that one. So thanks for that. Thanks for sharing those. So taking a look then at the best practices and what we should do and what we should be looking at. And our first piece of information is that we begin by focusing on the audience, because, and you'll see this more in the one-day session when I go through it, the slides is actually the last part of your presentation. All of the planning goes into it in advance so that the slides complement what you're saying, rather than you building what you're saying around the slide deck. So you're thinking about your content. What are you going to include? What needs to be included? What level of detail? Back to the point that was made there, what level of detail needs to be included? And you're starting by thinking, well, who is this for? Because if you are giving an update within your team and everybody is familiar with the language that's around, then you can have a certain type of presentation. If you're giving an update to the client who might not be as familiar with the jargon and the technical language that you're using, then your presentation may need to be tweaked. So who is it for? And the leading in from that then is well, what information do they have on this topic already? And more importantly, what do they need to know? What's the purpose of what I'm doing? What do I want them to take action at the end of this? Is it that I want them to be up to speed with the progress that we've made in the project in the past week or 2 weeks or whatever the time frame is? So what do they need to know? And what will they not care about? What are the things that I feel are really important, but in reality, the person who's listening to this does not care. It's not relevant to them. There is a phrase that some of you might have heard before. It's called the curse of knowledge. And it was a study that was done in a university, American university, whose name escapes me at the moment, but they put people into pairs. And one person was the tapper and the other person was the listener. And the tapper had to tap out on the desk a song, a well-known song. So for example, and hopefully my sound will be loud enough for you to hear this. So the tapper tapped out a song. The listener had to try to identify what the song was. There were 120 cases, and of that, the listeners got it correct 3 times. If you had identified there that was Happy Birthday, then well done, you would have been one of the correct cases. However, what was interesting was the tappers had expected, in 50% of the cases, the tappers expected that people would get what they were tapping out. So 50% was the expectation. In reality, it was only 2.5% of the cases who got it right. Because when we know something, when it's in our heads, it's very difficult to imagine not knowing it. And that is why we can find that we're using jargon, we're using terminology that people aren't familiar with, and that our content isn't connecting with the listener. So think of that the next time around you're putting a presentation together. Is the person who's listening to it familiar with all of the content, that's the type of language that you're going to be using? The next thing with regard to content is making sure that you're keeping 1 point per slide. So there was a point made there in the chat about, having X number of slides for whatever number of minutes content. I wouldn't work so much on how many slides you have as to what level of detail is in the slides. If you've got 40 slides in a 30-minute presentation and those slides are really dense, really content heavy, then that's a lot. If you've got 40 slides that have as little information as what I have on these here, then it's flowing along smoothly. It's a different type of situation. So it's not so much I need X number of slides as in what do the slides look like? How are they going to appear? How, is this going to be information overload? Remember that dumping. Is this going to be information overload for the person who's listening to it? When you're thinking about the audience as well, think about where are they going to be accessing this from? So back when, if you were at a conference, for example, and you had everybody in the same room together and everybody is looking up at the screen, or you're in the boardroom and everybody is viewing the same presentation on the same screen and they have the same experience. So if a font doesn't appear very clearly on the screen, it's evident to the presenter as well as everybody else. But now you're going to have more remote situations and continuing into hybrid working. People are viewing it on different size screens and their experience can be different. And it's something to bear in mind as well. If somebody's looking at your presentation with a very detailed graph on a small screen, it's going to be very difficult for them to be able to make out what they're seeing. So have a think about it from the user experience as well. Everything is changed since March of 2020 and is going to continue that way. For some of you, you might have been used to dialing into meetings before this, but even that whole hybrid meeting experience is changing and becoming much more inclusive for companies because they're aware of having everybody involved. It's no longer enough just to be on the end of a phone dialing in. For readability for the slides, thinking about it again from that user experience. So little test for yourselves here. I've got 3 different font sizes. So what size font would you think is being used in each of those? Give you a moment just to have a guess. Let's see if you're right. Because people normally underestimate. The first one is size 90. Now that's a very large font to be using, but just take a look at it on your screen and see, does that look excessively huge? Font 32. And then for the last one, font 18. Now for a lot of people, they tend to use font size 12 or 14 on their slides, but take a look at what's there and what's your experience as the audience for each of those font sizes. So think about that. What is it going to look like for the person who is reading the slides, who's looking at your slides? Again, back to that point that we had, if you're sending out your follow-up slides afterwards, that's going to be more detailed. That's different. You can have those with your smaller font size. You can include more information on it. But what you're presenting, then think about it from what the audience are seeing. And if you remember the point that I made earlier about when there's lots of text on a slide, this pains me to put up this slide every time, but it's for demonstration purposes only. Because you see here, there's a slide, there's a lot of text on it. And while I'm speaking to you, chances are you're skimming through it, you're skimming through both sides, and hopefully you'll recognize that that's the point that I was making a couple of moments ago about everybody having the same experience in the room when they were in a room together before March of last year, as opposed to the way things are now. But that slide, and I've seen far worse than this with regards to amount of text, that slide is text heavy. I can't keep your attention when I have that slide up because you're reading it. You're half listening to what I'm saying. If I want to improve that slide, immediately one of the things that I can do is remove the full sentences so that I have cleaned it up. And I'll be speaking a little bit more about how I can improve that further again later on in the presentation. But by simply keeping the same points there, but not using full sentences, I have immediately made it easier for you to read and hopefully get your attention straight back to what I'm saying an awful lot faster. Another thing to consider with the readability is what is the font style that you're using? And ideally having no more than 2 different types of font when you're using it. Now you've got the serif and the sans serif one. The ones on the right are recognized as being easier to read. The serif with the little foot at the end of the letters is generally more difficult to read. And, quick Google search will suggest to you different fonts that are best. Sometimes it could be that you're using ones that are, that you've got your brand guidelines and you have to use the ones that are on the brand guidelines. But have a look and see what way do they look? How are they going to be readable for the audience that are there? And similarly, when you're talking about brand guidelines, you may well have your color guidelines. But take a look at that as well. What way does color work, particularly if it's different color font? What is that going to look like when people are viewing it? You're going to use color for contrast. But if you take a look at the couple of examples that I've got coming up here, you know, if I'm using black or white against a colored background, what does that look like? Test it out. I would always suggest to test anyway. If you have a presentation coming up and you're trying something different, set up a Zoom or a Teams meeting and then log in as a participant to see what's this going to look like? What's the user experience? If I have different color font on white background, again, we can see the difference that's there. How is it going to look for the person who is reading it? Are they going to be able to read clearly what you have said? So be cautious when you are using different color fonts on different color backgrounds. And, you know, particularly for highlight, it can look really effective. If you're highlighting something in particular, it can look very effective, but make sure that the color works on the screen that people are going to be looking at. Mentioned about bombarding with text and having information overload, and it's pulling it back. And you know, there's the phrase that's there about a picture paints 1,000 words, and using images can be very effective when you are wanting to make a point. You know, if you think there, I spoke early on about people who use their slides as a crutch, or that they use it as a dumping ground, and the images are there. So if you're looking back on these slides, you know, in a couple of months' time, hopefully just the image, that crutch, that dumping ground is the trigger to remind you of what it was that I was speaking about. When you're doing your presentation, quite often people go into Google and they just take an image from Google, or you see there very often that there's that stock image logo that's going across it, and it takes away from the professional look. 3 websites that have that are free to use, that you can, that there's no license needed for the images: Pexels, Pixabay, and Unsplash. So go on to any of those, do a Google search for, put into the search bar for what it is that you're looking for. So, you know, woman sitting with a laptop, and you'll get your range of images that are there. They're free to use, and it's more professional looking rather than having stock image as the watermark across the images that you're taking a look at. But also you have from images, it can be using graphs, charts, that's going to be that visual display of the information. And I've got just a very straightforward, simple example that's here, where you've taken, you know, taken a schedule that's there where everything is written out, and you've got a lot of words that's there, and there's only 3 points in it, whereas that can be summarized so much more quickly if you were to put a quick graph together. And using tools that are going to be making it simple, easy to read. Remember the key point that I said is the information that you're including on your charts, making it, or on your slides, making it easier for the audience to better understand or better remember what it is that you're saying. And it's far easier to remember what you're seeing in that slide there rather than seeing the text as I had on the previous one. So thinking about it, taking a little bit of time, how are you going to visually demonstrate what the points are that you're making in a way that will get people will get it straight away. Plus, they're going to be listening to you far more when there's just something small like that, rather than having the lots of text that's there. So it's always about remembering, you know, you are the presenter. You are sharing your expertise. If you are confident and competent in the way in which you are demonstrating that and delivering your presentations, that gets you noticed. That helps to advance you up the career ladder so that you are able to communicate confidently and clearly what you want to demonstrate to people, and being able to distill your information and explain it clearly and concisely is a great skill to be able to have. And your slides are there to back you up. They're the support act, you're the main event. And when you are putting those slides together, then you're thinking about how can you have variety in them. It's keeping the consistency that I'll be speaking about in a few moments, but that there's the varying. So you might notice from my slides there that sometimes the text is on the right, sometimes it's on the left. It's not the same slide appearing in the same way every single time. The brand colors are used slightly differently so that you're keeping people's attention. It looks different when the slide changes. One of the ways that you can really keep people's attention and keep their focus so that you are drip feeding the information in a way that you want them to see it is by using animations. And I have animations and transitions here. So animation, when you're bringing your points in one at a time or whatever way you're choosing to do so. And then the transitions moving between the slides when you're moving on from one slide onto the next. For both of them, the key thing, keep it simple. You don't want animations bouncing in from one side and, you know, you see the fancy transitions where, you know, the slide sort of can be sort of screwed up like a piece of paper and thrown away, or there's these fancy curtains and all of that. They're very distracting when you've got either animations or transitions overused. So keep it simple, less is more. And just for an example, back to the slide, remember that slide I had a few minutes ago where I was talking about before March of 2020 and the way that people's experience was when they were all in the room together. And then I narrowed it down to 4 bullet points on each side. So if I were to be delivering that in a proper presentation and speaking about it, then what I would do is bring in each point at a time. So I am now controlling exactly what the audience sees. You can't be reading ahead because you don't have the information there. I'm allowing myself the time to discuss the point that I'm making. And then when I'm ready, I move on to my second point and then my third point, speak about it as long as I want, and my fourth point. And then, for example, I might decide, well, I don't need to spend as much time talking about the second half, so I can bring all of those in together. Now, at the end of that, you still have, as the audience, you still have that same amount of information in front of you, but it has come in slowly, it's been drip fed in, and you don't have that same sense of overwhelm. And similarly, if it is a case that you have a graph and you need to have a lot of detail on that graph, see, is there a way that you can build up that detail gradually so that you're creating that story around it, telling the story around the graph rather than just putting up, boom, here's all your information. And people are spending time trying to figure it out. What's this? Where does that match up? And again, they're not listening to you. So using animations can be a very effective way for you to get audience attention. Making sure that you are consistent in your slides. I had mentioned that before. So that consistency with your font, the font type, maximum of 2 types. You might choose to have one for headings and one for your main text. Consistency with the font type and consistency with your font size. Consistency with your image size. So if you've got images there, go into your toolbar up at the top and size them so that they're all similar size, that they're in a similar place on the slide so that it all moves very smoothly and professionally from one onto the other. That you've got consistency with your color throughout. And then when you're delivering a team presentation, make sure that it looks consistent all the way through the presentation, so that if you've got 2 or 3 different people inputting, that it doesn't look like this one stops here and the next one starts and it jars. It needs to look consistent all the way through, and it creates that professional approach about it as well. Back to what we were speaking about for animations and transitions. And for animations, when you go into your toolbar, the easiest ones, the one that I've been using here, is just the simple appear. Fade is a nice one that isn't going to cause too much of a distraction. And the third one is the float, where it comes up slowly. Even if that can, depending on the amount of animation you have, that float one can be a little bit too much sometimes. So just test them out, see what works. It depends on how fast you're bringing them in. And on the timer point of view, I always have it set that it's when I click that the next animation comes up, rather than it being set on a timer, because that can put you under pressure, that you're rushing to keep up with what you have on your animation. Transitions, moving from one slide directly to the next. Again, keeping that really simple. Cut, fade, push are the simplest ones that aren't going to be a distraction for the audience. It needs to flow very, very smoothly. The next tip that I would give on this is, when you have your full slide deck together, have a look and see, does it all fit properly? So if you go into your slide sorter view, so when I was preparing this slide deck, I went in, and this is a screenshot of what I saw. So I can immediately see there the way in which the slides look. And what I noticed, first of all, was that up at the top, where I had the three main parts of what I was going to be speaking about today, I had, if you like, my title slides there in 3 sections. And I thought, okay, I'm actually going to be finishing off with a summary, and there's no break between my presentation and the summary. So I've inserted the next slide that's coming up here. My summary slide comes up. You will see if there's an image that's looking out of place, or if any of the font size doesn't sit or flow properly. It gives you a nice view as to how things are. So definitely worth spending a moment just going in, doing that quick check in your slide sorter view to see, what's this going to look like? And that moves me on then to the next slide, the one that I added in when I had a look at that, which is the summary. Because when we're taking a look here at what we're after going through today, your starting point is thinking, first of all, about what you're going to be speaking about, rather than opening up the laptop, pulling out the slide deck, throwing in or reusing a slide that you've used, a deck that you've used before. It's taking a look and seeing, what do I want to achieve from today? What's the point of today's meeting? What's the information that I need to convey? Do I need slides? And if I do, how can I create slides that are going to help with the audience to better understand or better remember what it is that I'm speaking about? That's your starting point. You're focusing on it again, like I said, from the audience point of view. So you're thinking about, what's the content that I need to include? Remembering what do they know already? What do they need to know? What do they not need to know? Can I pull out jargon? Do I need all of this information? How am I creating my slides so that they back up what I'm saying, that they are a visual aid? I'm the presenter, and they are aiding me to communicate my message clearly and concisely. And then how about the readability? So, people could be looking at this maybe on desktop screen, or maybe it's on a laptop or on a tablet. It can be a small screen. So the slides that I'm doing, are they going to be easy for people to see? Is my font legible? What about the colors that I'm using? How is this going to be for the audience experience, the person, even if it's other team members that are there? How am I going to make sure that I have this right? And my suggestion to people always is, don't wait for the big presentation to implement any tips that you've learned here today. If you see a couple of things from today's presentation that you think, yeah, that's a good idea, then do that the next time you're putting a presentation together. Start now so that it becomes habit and practice for implementing all of these. You're thinking about how you're going to get and maintain people's attention. Remember what I said, people are tempted to be working there in the background, getting something else done. You want to keep their focus all of the time. How are you going to do that? Images are a great way to do that. If you're using graphs or any visual demonstration, then make sure that it is easy to read, that it only has the amount of information on it that is required, that the story is very obvious. I saw somebody have a slide once that had a graph on it, quite a lot of detail, and in a different color box at the bottom, she had just highlighted what the main point was. So sales are on target for this quarter. It was summarized, and it was really good, because if you wanted a bit more information, you could go and you could look at the chart, but you got what it was about there, summarized in the box at the bottom. Vary the slides so that it's not the same thing coming up again and again and again. There's a little bit of difference between each slide that's coming up to keep people's focus and keep their attention, but remembering to have that consistency in your font type, your font size, in the colors that you're using, images, where things are placed on the slide, so that people aren't confused. When we get confused, we stop listening, so that people aren't confused and they're paying attention to what it is. And then thirdly, that you might take a look at how you can introduce information gradually, that you're in control of it, that people aren't seeing everything up front, that you're bringing it in piece by piece as is needed and as is relevant to the presentation that you're delivering. So you might have a slide that you're talking about for 3 or 4 minutes. Do you need to have all of that information up at the beginning, or can you break it into sections and talk about each piece at a time? But for your animation, remember that you are going to be keeping it very simple and making sure that there is that consistency throughout it. You don't want people to be, watching things bouncing off to the left and to the right and all that type of thing. It takes away from the professionalism of it as well. So that is my overview from what we have today. I'll put my details up there. As I said, my name is Maureen McCown, Business is Soft Skill Success, and I share lots of tips on LinkedIn and blog posts and so on. So I'm delighted if you'd like to connect with me there, and I will have a listen to see what questions have come in. Elva, if you have any questions for me there from that section.